Syd Barrett passed away in July 2006. Despite having shunned his fame and celebrity for over 30 years, his relatively small musical legacy has endured. This piece explores Syd's lasting appeal. In the mid-1960s, Pink Floyd played a residency at Soho's The Marquee Club. They were supported by Pete Banks.
The band that I was in at the time, Sin, we occasionally supported Floyd, which is not something we look forward to very much, because Sin at that time, we were more of a Motown soul kind of band, although we did start writing our little mini rock operas and became very pretentious and eventually became somewhat psychedelic ourselves, psychedelic with a small p. Floyd then were a very loose band. I mean, basically they used to play 12 bars. I think they used to do, I'm not sure if it was Smokestack Lightning, but something in E, and that would go on for 20 minutes, and they might have even done a Bo Diddley Roadrunner, something like that. And they were pretty inventive. I was very impressed with Syd. Certainly Syd looked like he was famous before he was famous. Syd had the charisma. He had that vibe about him. He was the kind of guy that when he walked in a room, people would look at him. You know, and he wasn't particularly crazily dressed, but he was very stylish. And you knew that Syd was cool. The other three guys, to me, they looked more like students. And they weren't very friendly. Syd was, you know, I could always talk to Syd because we'd just talk, you know, myself being a guitar player, we would talk guitar stuff and, you know, just the usual mundane stuff. And Syd would always say, hello, how you doing? You know, the other three I regarded then, being working class, well, obviously I still am, they were very posh.
Norman Smith met Syd Barrett when he was assigned by EMI to produce Pink Floyd's first album.
Well, he was not terribly vociferous, Syd, and pretty difficult to get to know in a really friendly, intimate way, you know what I mean? It would only really come through by going into the studio, and we start a run through, and they would roughly go through it with me sitting in there to see what I thought, you know, that kind of thing. But he didn't act as an MD, as a musical director with the Floyd at all. Said very little, but I mean, he spoke through his songs.
Barrett also worked with Norman Smith on one of his final compositions for Pink Floyd, Jug Band Blues.
So at the end of this title, I did say to Syd, well, you know, Syd, I really fancy some extra orchestration going on this title. So he said, oh yeah, what? So I said, well, something like I hear a bit of like a brass band. So he said, oh yeah, he said, yeah. He said, a Salvation Army band. So I said, Salvation Army band? Why Salvation Army band? He said, well, I don't know really. He said, he said, I think I can hear that, a Salvation Army band on it. So I said, okay, fine. I'll see if I can get a Salvation Army band. Which was pretty difficult to get the Salvation Army band, but eventually I did. And by the time I got it, I couldn't get into Abbey Road Studios, so I booked Delane Studios. And we went in for this overdub of the Salvation Army Boys band. Must have been at least 12 of them, I think. Might have been 14. Sat them down in the studio at Delane Studios, and Delaney, and no Syd. He hadn't turned up. And it was a 7 till 10, I remember, 7 till 10 session. And 7:30 came, no Syd. quarter-to-8 came. I went out in the studio and apologised to the guys all sitting there, you know. But we're waiting for Syd Barrett, who has some ideas about what he would like you to play, etc. So anyway, quarter-to-8, nearly an hour later, Syd arrives. So I said, goodness gracious me, thank God you've arrived. I've got the Salvation Army band out in the studio. Come and meet him. Took him into the studio, and I said to the musicians, I said, well, this is Syd Barrett. Syd, this is the Salvation Army band. So, oh yeah, okay. So I said, now, Syd, I haven't said anything or played anything back yet to the band, but I would like to, or we would like to hear what you have in mind, what you would like them to do. So he said, so I said, what have you got in mind? He said, I said, what would you like them to play? Well, I don't know, play anything, really. So I said, no, they can't just play anything, Syd. We've got to have definite ideas. I said, I haven't written out any dots for them or whatever. I wanted to hear what views you had. Well, I don't know. He said, I said, well, what would you like them to play? So he said, well, I don't play anything. Play anything they like. So I said, well, they can't really do that, Syd. Okay, leave it to me. So he left the studio. Not only left the studio, the studio, but left the building, just completely had gone. And he left me with this band, with no dots that I'd written or anything. So anyway, I said, well, I'll play it back to you. And so I played it back to them. I said, now, the only thing I think that we can do, which I have in mind, is that, well, and I told them where they could come in and what sort of phrasing they could do. So I said, but has anybody got any ideas about chord sequences? Do anybody know anything about chord sequences? They said, well, no, not really. So I said, okay. Well, you'll have to give me a little while and I'll write something down. And I jotted it down. And that's the way I struggled through that we got through that session. And I dreaded it. I left it on the track, of course, and on the album. But I dreaded listening to it. And I don't know how it sounded to you or to the public, but I was rather embarrassed, just to put it mildly.
Syd Barrett retired from the music industry in 1974 and spent the rest of his life reclusively in Cambridge. Despite his withdrawal from public life, Syd Barrett's music is still as popular today as it ever was.
When you listen to his stuff, it's like you're brought back to your own childhood. You go back to times when you were small and those things were important to you. And he's able to capture that very precisely, that part of childhood and then of young adolescence. But also his particularly English sensibility as well, which is quite hard to capture in music. Easier to capture on paper in literature and poetry and you know, in fantasy literature, children's literature, in traditional Lewis Carroll and stuff. But very difficult to capture in music, and he did that. And in like the kind of music he did, psychedelic rock music, it's quite rare, really.
It was never meant to last, and you could not imagine Syd Barrett making another 3 or 4 albums with Pink Floyd. You could not imagine, to saying this as a fan looking from the outside, it's impossible to imagine him having a 40-odd year career in the way that David Gilmour and Roger Waters have had, playing Live 8, you know, touring and playing stadiums. That's not what Syd Barrett was all about. And to many of the people that knew him and people that have spoken about this, is, you know, he wasn't meant for this world, if you like. He was an artist, and he was an artist who was dabbling in pop music. He gave up his studies as an artist to go away and become a pop star. And like many, many people since, it didn't suit him.
There's also a sense that that's kind of necessary, that at the time what they were doing in order to sort of create a sort of sheer incandescent music, you know, to sort of have such a, you know, huge impact on that moment, they actually practically had to sort of throw themselves on their own sort of creative bonfire, as it were. You know, they did have to sort of burn themselves out. And I think that therefore someone like Syd Barrett is, you know, is much more of a kind of effective, to a mythological sort of figure or whatever. I mean, sometimes people call him tragic. I'm not necessarily certain that he was. I mean, for a start, I think he did what he wanted to do. He wanted, you know, he was kind of broken in lots of ways, but he did what he wanted to do. He kind of, you know, he receded entirely from the scene. He reinvented himself as an artist. And so it's not, you know, so there's not necessarily a tragic thing. And then also it's a kind of instructive thing. I actually wish that more people did what Syd Barrett has done, which is to sort of retire completely and voluntarily from making rock music. Hardly anybody does.